Hello everyone, welcome back to the channel. Today we're going to get on with part 2 of remixing DJ Seduction's Hardcore Heaven. In this video we're going to go over the processing, all the different things I did for the mixdown, and we'll go in order from top to bottom, which is the order in which I usually do my mixdowns. At the top of Ableton you'll always see my breaks and any drums that I might have used, and then straight underneath that, usually in red, will be my sub bass. After that it will usually be any synths, piano, strings, horns, all that sort of stuff. Basically any instruments will be straight after the bass, and then there'll be vocals, and then right at the bottom we'll have any effects such as risers, downers, impacts, drones, that sort of stuff. Okay, so here you can see the first break, and on the chain of processing for this break, the first thing you'll see is the EQ8. We're using EQ8 to roll off the bass frequencies in order to create space for our actual bass line. We're also using EQ8 to dip some frequencies around 300 Hz. This is just to remove some mud from the break, seeing as it was recorded from vinyl. And then we have a high shelf boosting some frequencies at the top end just to add a bit of brightness. The next effect that we have in the chain for the processing of this break is Ableton's drum bus. Now I like to use this because we can add drive and a bit of crunch to the break. We can also use the transient style to enhance or to reduce any of the transients that we do or don't like. The drum bus also adds a little bit of compression, but I don't tend to muck about with that too much. And then the next thing on the chain we've got is some parallel processing. And we usually achieve that by using the Ableton audio effect rack, and we'll have two chains in the effect rack, one which will be the dry signal and the other one will be the wet signal. And on the wet chain we will add in the glue compressor, and we'll change the settings so that we are basically making up about 5 dBs usually, and we will adjust the threshold so that the needle is only hitting 5 in the meter. Now because we're only going to be using this as parallel compression, we'll just feed in the amount that we actually want using the volume control on the chain itself. So we can push the ratio right up, we can change the release and attack so that it's quite quick, and that is pretty much it for the parallel compression. We literally just use the volume control of the wet chain to bring up the level of the compressed signal back into the chain of effects. And then the final piece of the puzzle at the end of this effect chain will be the utility, which we'll simply use to check the phase of the drums, and we'll set certain frequencies to be in mono. Now usually when we're doing processing for vinyl, anything below 500 Hz needs to be in mono. This is so that we don't have any phase cancellation between any of the elements. And why this is important is that the needle will jump out of the groove if there's any phasing going on. So anything below 500 Hz goes to mono. And that last part about the utility effect being the last effect in this signal chain applies to all of the channels in this track. In fact, in all of my tracks, because I want to ensure that there's no phase cancellation in anything that I make. So as you can see, on this second break, we've got processing that is more or less the same as the processing of the first break. One of the main things that we will want to check is for phasing between the two breaks. And the simple way to do this is to use the utility in Ableton. So if you look at the utility, under input at the top of it, there's two buttons, a left and a right, and they've got like a phase icon in them. You can use those to switch the phase of whatever signal is coming into it, which in this case is the second break. Now when I'm checking for phase cancellation issues, I'll solo both breaks together, and then I'll play them and look at the meter to see how high the peak value is. And then I'll change the phase on the second break and play them again together, and then see if the level is higher or lower. Now chances are, if the level is higher, once you've changed the phase, then the two breaks were out of phase with each other, and you should leave the second break with the phase changed. Now once I know that phase is fixed, usually the next thing I'll do is look at the EQ of the two breaks and get them to sit next to each other nicely. Usually it'll involve ducking out any mud frequencies, possibly boosting the high end of the break just to bring out some brightness, and sometimes I might have to try and clean up some harsh resonant frequencies, so usually I'll be doing some targeted EQ to find where they are and then heavily reduce them. Doesn't look like I needed to do much targeted EQing though, so fortunately that means we can move on to the next instance of the second break, which is just a hi-hat loop that I created. I moved this onto a different channel simply so that I could more harshly EQ the low end out of it, because it's just hi-hats. I don't need to maintain the frequencies of anything lower than is required. Then moving on to the clap channel, same sort of thing, the processing all looks the same. I EQ'd off the low end that isn't required. It's got some transient shaping on it via the drum bus. I added ozone imager there just so that I could check on the width, and as it was quite a narrow sample, because it was recorded from vinyl, I decided to add a bit of width using imager. After that, we've got the standard parallel compression that we've seen previously, and then we also have the utility making everything below 500 Hz into mono. Similarly, we see the exact same kind of processing going on the 909 core kit, so there isn't really a great deal to talk about on that processing. Okay, so now we're looking at the bass channel, or the sub bass channel I should say, and the first thing we have is the 808 bass EQ preset that I made, which is just rolling off some real low end and anything above 1000 Hz. Following that is the bass low extender preset from the glue compressor, and usually I don't muck about with this too much because I like the way that it sounds already, and I just use similar principles of processing that I use in the parallel compression, which is have makeup gain somewhere around 5 dBs and have the threshold dial adjusted such that the needle doesn't go beyond 5 on the meter. After that, we do have some parallel compression, and then finally the utility ensuring that everything is in mono. Okay, moving on to the first stab from Hardcore Heaven, which is the low stab, and this is where things get a little bit more interesting. Obviously we have my standard effect chain going on, and I think the only new thing that might be in there is the addition of ozone imager, which is adding a little bit of width to the stab sound because it's going to sound quite mono coming from vinyl. But the additional thing that's interesting on this particular channel is the fact that we're using a send or a return channel in order to control the reverb. Okay, so now looking at the return channel, which has the reverb and a series of compressors on it. Now, the thing to focus on here is that we have set the reverb to only reverb certain signals, so up around the midsection of the frequency range, and we have also set a relatively long decay, but we're going to control the amount of that with the dial for the return. I'll explain that in a second. And then the other thing that I've changed is the amount of diffuse happening on the reverb, and what this does is this controls the amount of sort of white noisy sort of sounds we get from the reverb. Okay, and then next on the chain we have all of the compressors. Now on each of these compressors we've enabled sidechain, and we're telling the compressor which channel we are taking the sidechain signal from. Then if you look at the mixer tab in Ableton, you'll see that there's a dial, which in this case is called A, which correlates to the A channel, which is the reverb return channel in this project. Now you can use this dial to send your signal into the return channel, which will then have the reverb applied to it. Now you use the compressor that's on the return channel to duck the reverb out of the way when your dry signal is playing, and then you only want the reverb to come into play once the dry signal goes above the threshold that you've set in the compressor. Now you may be asking why you would do this rather than just putting the reverb directly onto the signal chain of the channel that you want to apply the reverb to. The answer to this is simply that if you just put the reverb directly onto your channel, it means that reverb is always going to be applied to your signal, which can make your mix really muddy. But if you put the reverb on the return channel and then have a compressor following it that is sidechained to your dry signal that you're feeding into the return, it means that then you can adjust the compressor settings so that you can control the amount of reverb that's returned based upon the threshold of the compressor. In layman's terms, what this is actually doing is it's ducking the reverb out of the way while your signal is below the threshold, and then when it goes back up above the threshold, it allows the reverb through. So essentially, once the signal for the vocal goes below the threshold, that means that the the vocal is nice and loud, you don't want to hear the reverb. But then as soon as the vocal ends or is ending, and that signal goes back up above the threshold, that's kind of when you want to hear the reverb. And it also works with delay too, and it just allows a lot more clarity in your mix. Next up is the beeps channel, and as far as the processing goes, it looks very much the same as we've seen before in the stab channel, where basically the EQA is rolling off the bottom end to allow space for the bass. There's some transient processing, there's some parallel compression, and then at the end there'll be a utility making sure that there's mono where it needs to be. And this is pretty much the pattern that will follow through for all of the other remaining channels in this project. So there's not a lot of point me repeating what I've already told you. So once all of the processing is figured out, I'll then move on to adjusting the levels using the mixer tab of Ableton. Now, unlike some producers, I don't mix into a limiter. I rather leave limiting and all of that sort of mastering stuff to the mastering engineer. It's not my job to master that stuff, and I don't really want to be limiting anything, so I tend not to do that. I know some people do, but I choose not to. Now, usually when you're sending a mixdown WAV or a pre-master to a mixing engineer, they will usually request that it goes no louder than -6 dB. So that's where I usually aim to have my master peaking at when I'm doing the mixdown. Now, what I'll usually do is I'll usually pull all of the levels down to, I don't know, somewhere around -10 or -12 dB, and it gives me plenty of space to muck around with all of the levels and adjust things as required, and then hopefully end up with being able to play the entire tune all the way through and not have the master channel go above -6 dB. Okay, so that's the review of the processing completed. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope it was informative, and without further ado, I will now play the full track for you.
Here it comes. Here it comes. Here it comes.